Once a levy of property-owning citizens, Rome's army became a professional force. By AD 1400, men guarded borders from the Rhine to the Euphrates. This video uses evidence to explain that shift and its impact on Roman politics. You'll learn how pay, land, and law tied soldiers to generals, not the state. When did that begin? The campus Marius in mid-3rd century BCE smells of dust tallow, and iron the sky is bright, the city's roar hushed as men gather beneath the shadow of the Quirinal. On a day ordered by census and custom they come, farmers, smallholders, and a few wealthier equites. Lined in centuries, someone shouting names the scrape of sandals on gravel, the metallic ring where shields meet. This is the Dauctus, the levy called by the census, a civic summons that turns land into duty, property into equipment. Polybius will later describe these levies as a militia bound by law and honor, men who serve not for wages, but for the city's sake, taking the sacramentum to their commander on behalf of the populace, the people. The decision at Rome's heart is simple, and stark arms are apportioned by fortune. Those with the heaviest ploughs purchase the heaviest arms, the poorest scarcely afford a spear. Property classes decide who carries the pilum, who bears the scutum, who mounts. A legion in this age is a human mosaic, roughly 200 infantry and some 300 cavalry, assembled each campaign season, and dissolved when winter drives men back to seed and harvest. The system is a political choice as much as a military one. Rome's magistrates prefer short wars close to home. Consuls arrive with authority only for a year. Armies must be raised anew each spring. The city's leaders calculate that unpaid civic zeal, modest stipendum, and the uncertain lure of booty will suffice. Livy records festivals and oaths, the solemnity of service. As a rite almost religious, you fight because Rome gave you land, law, and a voice. Yet even as the shield wall forms and testudo-like ranks march in order, a quiet tension coils beneath the formalities. The farmer soldier keeps one eye on the season. If the campaigning delays, harvest fails. If a wintered campaign gathers momentum, homes rot and debts mount. What happens when wars do not end with the harvest? The Roman state answers that question first by habit, then by necessity. Decision follows pressure as Rome steps beyond the Italian horizon. Sicily, Spain, and the Hellenistic East offer riches, but they also demand protracted presence. A general cannot pick up an army in spring and simply dissolve it at the first frost when operations require months of sieges or winter garrisons. The Roman response is incremental. Magistrates allow longer tour stipends, are regularized, the lure of plunder becomes part of the bargain. In practice, the farmer returns from war to find fields neglected, perhaps mortgaged, sometimes sold. The casualty is not only cropland, but the social compact service, as a seasonal duty is replaced by a circuit of campaigns that stretch households thin. At the same time, Rome's enemies teach costly lessons. Hannibal's invasion devastates the Italian countryside and proves the fragility of seasonal levies when homeland defense becomes a year-round affair. Spain's terrain and guerrilla tactics reveal the price of garrisoning provinces and securing lines of communication. The consequence is demographic and economic. Smallholders shrink in number. Latifundia, large estates, spread under absentee owners who exploit slave labor raised from war prisoners. Grievances grow not only in the fields but in the forum, where tribunes and populars like the Gracchi will later invoke the militia's decline to argue for land reform. The political decision to restore the citizen army is taken in the name of saving the republic, yet the remedy fractures the assemblies and fans popular anger into violence. This erosion is not merely economic, it is personal. As the levy becomes a tool for extended service, the bond between soldier and state frays. Men begin to look to generals for shelter, pay, and plots. When commanders keep men in the field through winter, when they distribute donativa and name centurions as favored clients, the soldier's allegiance mutates. He fights for the man who feeds him and rewards him not for a yearly oath to an annually elected consul. Polybius's image of a militia bound by civic duty becomes an archive image, true of a Rome still largely continental, but less so for an expanding Mediterranean polity, where winter never truly ends and armies learn to be permanent. A single sensory moment seals the change campfires under alien stars, the metallic clink of coins dropped into waiting palms, men who expect land in return for loyalty. The consequence is political commanders who forge such bonds can return to the pomerium not just as magistrates, but as patrons with clients ready to follow their standards into the city. The forward pull is immediate and dangerous. Rome must either remold its institutions to the reality of permanent armies or risk the army remolding the state. In the twilight of one campaigning season, as recruits fold their cloaks and the city bell tolls for the new census, a question hangs in the March air like a warning: how long will a republic survive when those who keep its borders no longer go home at winter's call? What happens when the militia never goes home? On the campus, Marius, mid-3rd century BCE, the city raised men by census and class. For the Doctus, a farmer in the first class, stood shoulder to shoulder with his neighbors, his spear and shield emblematic of property and duty. The decision to bind service to property produced a neat rhythm. Seasonal campaigns, then harvest, and men swore the sacramentum, a binding vow to their commander, and the res publica. In action, this produced an army that fought like a civic phalanx, modestly paid and hungry for booty. Polybius and Livy record a system that depended on proximity and the expectation of a quick return. The consequence was stability so long as Rome fought within Italy and across short sea lanes. The forward pull arrives when Rome's wars stop fitting the calendar of a farmer. By the mid-3rd century, Rome chose to pursue interests on a wider map, Sicilia, Hispania, and the Hellenistic East, and the decision to hold territory abroad remade service into a round-the-year demand. Hannibal's invasion made the cost immediate: fields burned, granaries smoldering, the air thick with the smell of smoke and charred wheat. Men could not simply go home at winter's end. Armies were kept in the field or rotated in desperate circuits. Stipendium grew more regular as commanders found coin easier than promise. The action of long tour bred a bitter consequence. Returning smallholders found ruined acres or auctions, and great estates latifundia swallowed land. Grievance hardened into politics, and Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus rose, claiming the militia itself must be saved by restoring citizen land. But the assembly split, and the agrarian cure reopened civic wounds. When manpower tightened in 107 BCE, the state faced a choice, and Gaius Marius made a fateful one. At the turn of the century in Numidia, and then the face of the Cimbrian threat, he accepted volunteers drawn from the Capite Censi, men previously excluded by the census. The action was practical. Cohorts drilled year-round became the basic unit. Service lengthened, and loyalty shifted from township to general. The consequence was immediate and political. Saturninus tied veterans' hopes to Marius with land bills, and the civic militia remained in law, while in practice men now enlisted for pay, plunder, and patronage. A new dependency had been authored in iron and oath. The social war of 91-88 BCE forced Rome to confront another decision: whether the allies who had bled for Rome would be denied the rights they had defended. The Lex Iulia and Lex Placia Papiria extended Roman citizenship across Italy, folding the socii into the Roman body politic. In action, the levies' legal map changed overnight. Commanders patched regiments with voluntarii who arrived through personal networks rather than municipal obligation. The consequence: the recruitment base swelled, but so did the reach of individual commanders who had spent long seasons shaping men into instruments of their ambition. The forward pull was the quiet forging of armies that answered first to a leader, then to the res publica. In 88 BCE, Lucius Cornelius Sulla made a decision that unstitched an ancient taboo. He marched his eastern legions on Rome. The scene was the Pomerium breached by veteran standards and seasoned cohorts in action. He seized the city, enacted proscriptions, and founded veteran colonies. The consequence was existential, the precedent that an army could unmake the very state that raised it, and subsequent commanders would learn that the road once open led not only to glory, but to power. Pompey's extraordinary commands in 67–62 BCE, the Lex Gabinia and Lex Manilia, show the Republic choosing exceptional imperium to meet exceptional threats. He policed the Mediterranean and settled kings as patrons in action. He recruited, paid, and rewarded on a Mediterranean scale. The consequence was to hollow out the Republic's annual magistracy. One man's imperium made the civic frame look narrow, and rivals learned to bargain with legions, not laws. The forward pull was the normalization of personal armies as instruments of statecraft. Julius Caesar's Gallic command refined the model into something more durable. Holding proconsular imperium long enough, he drilled legions that wintered among the enemy, bound by shared danger and donativa, and promoted centurions who owed their posts to him. The action turned soldiers' careers into long arcs tied to one man's fortunes. The consequence became inevitable when he crossed the Rubicon. Men who had no seasonal home marched for Caesar, not a civic levy. The forward pull was the erosion of the idea that militia service returned a man to his plough. After Caesar's murder, the Second Triumvirate chose proscriptions as fiscal policy. Property became pay, and vengeance-funded armies. In action, Philippi and the settlement of veterans carved Italy into estates and colonies, and the consequence was brutal clarity. Promises of land and coin could buy loyalty when legal structures could not. The forward pull was a stark lesson for the next ruler. Loyalty lasts only while the purse and plot are open. Octavian, after Actium, made an opposing decision to shrink the crisis, fix units to frontiers, and create a permanent apparatus under his control. He demobilized rivals, reduced legions, and stationed cohorts along Rhine, Danube, and Euphrates. The Praetorian Guard became a city garrison of the princeps. The action produced order and prosperity. The consequence was institutional change. The princeps now owned the army's time. The forward pull asks what happens when those who possess the standards possess the streets. Augustus created the aerarium militare to fund premia and standardized terms of service, roughly 20 years for legionaries, turning service into a career. Men swore the sacramentum now to the princeps in a new political grammar. Marriage restrictions and promotion ladders made militancy a profession with predictability. The consequence was durable stability, but also dependence. Paymasters governed loyalty, and arrears, or a weak succession, could unsettle the whole structure. As the late Augustan years show through tombstone inscriptions and forts, frontiers made professionals. Soldiers from the provinces filled ranks, auxiliaries traded service for citizenship and life. Inside the fort produced a community with its own law, gods, and savings. The action of living together, training together, and serving year after year turned milits into a social caste. The consequence was that an army could bargain collectively and quickly test the mettle of a new emperor. When Augustus died in AD 14, the decision of discharged stability met its first real test: mutinies on the Rhine and in Pannonia. Germanicus walked among angry cohorts, donativa, and concessions, buying time. The consequence was a revelation. 300,000 professionals now guarded Rome's world, and their oath bound them to a person, not an abstract republic. A standard flutters on a wall outside the city, and the final chilling question hangs: which camp will next decide to use that standard against Rome itself? What do you do when the republic runs out of men? The answer in 107 BCE came under a punishing North African sun in the scrub and sand of Numidia, where Gaius Marius watched the line of tents and the hollow places in his roster. The Jugurthan War had bled men, and patience. News from the north spoke of migrating tribes, the Cimbri and Teutons, pressing into Italy like a tide that would not wait for harvest. In the camps at the fringes of Roman power, The air tasted of sweat, and iron, the crack of leather harness against shields, a constant metronome. The old levy, called out from the campus Marius, and sorted by the census, men ranked by property and plough, could not meet wars that lasted beyond a campaigning season or fought where winter never truly ended. Civic duty, once a neat right and burden, threatened to suffocate in the Republic's growing distances. Marius made a decision that was administrative and revolutionary. At once he accepted volunteers from the Capite censi. Where the census had once barred the poorest from heavy arms, he opened the ranks to those with no land to return to. Ancient writers argue. Sallust wondered whether necessity or ambition moved him. Plutarch framed it as part genius, part gamble. The dispute over novelty matters to historians, but in the mud of Numidia, the choice read simply as relief. Men were needed now, and the Capite censi were ready to take arms. They brought hunger and readiness in equal measure, and they would bind their fortunes to the man who enlisted them. The action that followed was as much organizational as ideological. Marius reorganized legions around cohorts, and legions of 10 cohorts, roughly 400-800 soldiers, became a more flexible instrument for campaigns that crossed seas and seasons. He lengthened service in practice, if not immediately by statute. These men trained through winters, drilled in enemy lands, and learned the bitter chord of shared hardship. The sacramentum began to feel less like a civic pledge to the res publica, and more like a bond to the man who fed, armed, and led them. Pay stipendium and the prospect of plunder or later settlement became the centerpieces of loyalty. Camps were no longer temporary musters, but mobile communities with winter quarters, kitchens, and the slow accretion of veteran ties. Consequences accumulated faster than Rome's lawyers could argue. In the city, Lucius Apuleius Saturninus seized the new reality and linked it to politics. Land bills promising veteran allotments tied soldiers' hopes to Marius' political fortunes. The promise of ager became an instrument of patronage. Settlement depended on who could secure it in the forum, and so soldiers began to measure civic arguments by the coin and the soil they might receive. Men who had once served for a season now looked to the commander for pay for plots of land and for the distribution of booty. The militia, that was by law a citizen obligation, began in practice to look like an enterprise of personal claims. This change altered relationships across Italy. Recruitment began to weave through networks of patronage and clientela, not solely through municipal levies. The social war that followed showed how dangerous the new pattern could be. Italian allies who had fought for Rome demanded citizenship and recognition after years in the ranks. When Rome extended the franchise, the legal map of the levy changed, swelling the pool of men, but also amplifying the personal reach of successful generals. The army grew numerically, but its loyalties grew personal and spatial. The long season under one man's gaze produced shared memories and private expectations. Sallust and Plutarch recorded these shifts with different outrage and curiosity, but both recorded the same practical reality. Soldiers who had no farms anchored themselves to commanders who promised land. The cohorted longer service legion was not only a military innovation, it was a political technology. 1,000 men who had once marched for the Republic now knew the weight of a centurion's hand and the comfort of a commander's purse. Organizationally, Rome had traded a citizen militia that melted back into fields for a professionalized corps that could winter on foreign soil and return as a vested interest. And so the Republic found itself dependent on the very instrument it had created to protect its expansion: men who would serve far beyond a single campaign and whose futures were tied to those who led them. The road from camp to city had narrowed into a line of standards and expectations, and it only took one march for the political order to be tested. Who would now be master of Rome, the law or the legions that owed more to a man than to a census? The image hangs: cohorts in winter, their banners whispering in the cold, each man's hand, remembering the oath and the promise of land, ready if called to march, not for fields but for power. It begins not with thunder from the hills, but with the small, intimate noises of war sandals scuffing flagstones, standards creaking on their poles, the metallic rattle of larica against breast and thigh. Rome in 88 BCE smelled of dust, and oil. The city that had always imagined itself defended by citizen farmers opened its gates to veterans who had learned to sleep with spears in foreign winters. Lucius Cornelius Sulla had been appointed to the command against Mithridates in Asia. Political maneuvering in the Forum stripped him of that authority, a tribune, and his rival Gaius Marius moved the machinery of the Republic to replace him. Faced with displacement, Sulla made a decision that altered the Republic's grammar. He summoned the legions he commanded in the east and marched for Rome. The choice was not theatrical bravado. It was a calculated response to law, honor, and the tangible needs of men who had endured years abroad. These were not the seasonal levy drawn from the Campus Martius, men who marched for a campaign and returned to vines and ploughs, but hardened cohorts forged by long service wintering on foreign soil, raised to expect pay, plunder, and ultimately land. Appian and Plutarch show how Sulla's veterans regarded him as the source of their security in Asia, and the social war they had bled under his signa, and trusted his judgment. When he ordered them south, roughly 6 legions, about 30,000 men by the human count of camp followers and spear-bearers, answered. They came not as citizens answering the call of the comitia, but as clients gathered around a single patron, their loyalty steeped in shared hardship, and the promises whispered at the end of a long march. Crossing the Pomerium was the moment the old taboo died. The Pomerium was more than an urban line. It embodied the idea that arms belonged outside the civic heart. To climb the Capitoline steps with legionary eagles and standards was to violate a ritual as old as the king's. Yet Sulla did, and the sound was not heroic music, but the heavy practical noise of men who had chosen a new calculation law could be enforced by force. He faced resistance. The streets were scenes of desperate civic struggle, blood and smoke. But the legions were efficient instruments of war, trained to obey orders regardless of whose tablets hung in the Forum. Decision led quickly to action, and then to a cascade of consequence. With Rome secured by steel, Sulla did not merely seize power for himself, he set the Republic on a different axis. He installed a dictatorship, instituted the leges Cornelii, and founded colonies to settle his veterans. Legal and material anchors meant to ensure that men who had followed him would not be left destitute when boots came off. Proscriptions and confiscations made the settlement possible. Property could be reallocated to pay promises, and fear became a tool of finance. Where once the farmer-soldier returned to a patch of land that knitted him to the civitas, now the veteran expected a grant, a premium, a tangible reward from the man who had led him. The Republic's chain of accountability, magistrates elected for a year, laws debated in assemblies, was not replaced instantly, but a new precedent was fixed in Roman law and memory. Armies could now be instruments of personal restoration, and the path from a province to the Forum was proven. There is an image that recurs in the account standards, passing under the same arches where years before they would have been forbidden, a cohort's eagle casting its shadow over temples and magistrates. Plutarch records the moral shock Romans felt the city's sacral order violated. But more practical minds noted the political fact: men who had been fed, paid, and promised land would remember who delivered the goods. Who then truly commanded their allegiance? Res publica, or the general who had kept his promise? That question, half philosophical and half mercantile, is the rhetorical hook at the heart of Sulla's march, when soldiers no longer fight simply as citizens, but as men whose future depends on a leader. What binds them to the state? What followed was not just Sulla's triumph and temporary restoration of senatorial authority, but a reconfiguration of power. Veterans planted in colonies across Italy would speak with votes and muscle. The judiciary and the Senate were temporarily strengthened by law, yet the crucial lesson had been taught in blood, and iron roads led to Rome, not only messengers. The sensory memory remains. dust rising in the forum as eagles passed the clang of military bronze, where once there had been only civic debate, and it carries a forward pull that no man of that era could forget. If a road could bring 30,000 veterans to the feet of a consul, how many more steps, how many more oaths, how many more promises would it take before another sword would cross the Pomerium for the last time? It is the summer of 67 BCE. The Mediterranean smells of salt and tar, and from the rostra in Rome to the harbors of Cilicia, men speak in a new key. The Senate hesitates the assembly's clamor, and a tribune named Aulus Gabinius offers an extraordinary remedy grant Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, a sweeping imperium to clear the sea lanes of pirates, and if need be to follow trouble into the east. The decision is not ceremonial but practical. Grain convoys choke the city. Trade by sea is the Republic's lifeblood, and the old system of one-year magistracies, and a levy summoned by the census, will not answer across a sea where winter never closes the campaigning season. Appian and Plutarch present the moment as a hinge. Rome chooses a man rather than a process, and that choice reveals the pressures that had already hollowed out the militia ideal. The scene thus begins with a legal fiction transformed into an instrument of logistics. The law hands one man an armada and a mandate for 3 years with authority extending across the Mediterranean and 50 miles inland. What was at stake was simple and brutal. Who would move men, feed them, and be responsible when the season did not end? Pompey's first orders are not orations but mobilizations. Sailing commissions are issued, crews mustered, and ships mass the clink of coin across wooden decks. Pay to rowers, pay to captains, becomes as important as the sound of oars. He recruits beyond the neat lines of the census volunteers, sailors, provincial levies, men who expect more than a season's duty. That is the decision that will alter the army's soul. He acts with speed. Ancient biographies claim the pirate menace was crushed in 40 days, a number that does as much for myth as for fact, but the deeper transformation is tangible. Pompey pays regularly, awards captains with estates or client kingships, and enfranchises supporters through settlement and status. In the east, after the Lex, Militia transfers the campaign against Mithridates to him. He makes bargains with kings, as if redrawing the map were an administrative task, installing client rulers, commuting revolts into alliances, and reorganizing provinces, so Rome's reach looks less like temporary expedition and more like permanent guardianship. The consequences appear first in small ways. Men who under the old Dauctus had been seasonal soldiers now find careers in the wake of a commander who supplies wages, triumphs, and patronage. The sacramentum, once sworn to the res publica, the state, becomes in practice an oath tied to the man who signs the payroll and decides the veterans' allotments. Veterans expect land and reward. Governors and commanders create the networks that bind soldiers to a person, not to a year or a census class. Appian and Plutarch do not simply tell of victories, they catalog a new political economy in which kings are settled, colonies planted, and entire regions stabilized by the general's largesse. The Republic's civic frame, annual office-holding rotation of duties, communal tie of the citizen soldier, thins under the pressure of one man's patronage that spans seas. This is not only a constitutional wrinkle, but an invitation to a different politics. If a single commander can police piracy, adjudicate settlements in the east, and distribute land as reward, then the ornaments of republican government look small and slow. By comparison, consuls, for year praetors rotating through courts, assemblies that debate while a fleet sails. Ambitious men observe that influence now flows through the legions, and the purse rather than solely through oratory or vote. Rival patrons learn to bargain the way provincial towns and client kings must, by offering security and pay. A general who holds imperium over broad waters can also cultivate loyalty in ways a magistrate sitting in the city cannot. He names centurions, he decides. Who receives a donative, he secures estates for veterans. The army ceases to be merely a civic duty discharged between harvests. It becomes an institution of patronage and permanence. The immediate political consequence is visible in the city's politics. Men who once sought office as a means of command now must reckon with men who command by other routes. The image is arresting. An individual with authority over a sea, his standards riding every harbor while Rome's magistrates cycle every winter. The long-term consequence is deeper still. Soldiers learn to look to commanders who can give, and commanders learn how power coagulates around giving. The Mediterranean becomes less a stage for short campaigns than a theater of continuous administration by personal authority. Appian's and Plutarch's portraits of Pompey are not merely eulogies of success, they are studies in a new form of sovereignty, one that combines the resources of the state with the discretionary will of a man. Consider the human scale, a single man's imperium for 3 years, a fleet sweeping the sea in the time it takes for a consul's single term to expire. Veterans settled by patronage, who now see their fortunes tied to the general who promised them fields. The rhetorical hook sits in the middle of this fact. What becomes of a republic that appoints a policeman for the world? The action Pompey takes solves immediate crimes and restores grain convoys, but its consequence is to reforge loyalty from civic habit to personal bond. The forward pull is grim and precise. If the Mediterranean can be policed by one magnate who will be left to defend the Republic's electoral year, its rituals, its magistracies, its promise that arms answer law, the image remains. Standards and veterans scattered like seeds along the coast, each a small pledge to a single man. And behind them, the slow question of whether Rome can still summon citizens to arms for the res publica rather than for the man who signs their pay. Snow lay in the folds of the Gallic hills, and the night smelled of wet wood and iron. The sharp tang of oil on mail, the sweeter stink of a cook's stew simmering over a brazier. In a winter encampment outside a hostile village, 1,000 men watched their standards like small silent gods, the eagle on its staff, the vexillum flapping the watchfires painting faces in orange. Julius Caesar lingered among them, not as a temporary magistrate passing through, but as an ongoing commander who could keep men in the field when Rome's magistrates were already back in the forum. The scene was ordinary and revolutionary at once. The decision that made this ordinary winter extraordinary was simple and legal. Caesar held proconsular imperium beyond an annual term, and he used it to keep legions under arms through the winter. Where the old levy, the dioctus, had called citizens by the census, mustered them for a season, and then sent them home to seed and plough, Caesar chose continuity. His commentaries record what he offered in exchange: donativa pay that arrived on time and shared danger that bound men to him in ways a ballot never could. A centurion's name was not merely a title, but a promise. A commander who promoted a centurion created a clientela, a dependency that reached into families and fields. The action that followed was logistical and cultural. Legions that once disbanded with the autumn harvest now dug winter quarters in enemy lands, fortifying, training, and scouring for plunder. Drills replaced the seasonal pause. Engineers kept working. Foragers and scouts extended Caesar's reach even when snow clogged the passes. A centuria still numbered roughly 80 men, a small tight knot of comrades, and 100 such knots could be shaped into a force that lived by campaign rhythm rather than civic calendar. Caesar's soldiers learned to count on a regular premium, and the steady distribution of booty. They learned their commander's voice and his gestures. When pay and promotion came from one man, the city's annual elections receded like a distant shore. The consequence was political chemistry. What binds a soldier more, the republic or the man who feeds him? That rhetorical question posed by the realities of the camp had an answer in human terms. Men whose careers spanned years, not seasons, looked to a patron who could settle claims, arrange land, and guarantee their families' futures. Caesar's commentaries show legions that wintered in Gaul becoming wealthy, by campaigning his donativa, were more than charity, they were investments in loyalty. They were also legal maneuvers by keeping Imperium Caesar avoided the immediate submission of his forces to the annual consuls and the ballot box. The sacramentum remained their formal pledge, but in practice obedience clustered around the man in the camp cloak as tightly as the troops clustered around the standard at dawn. The broader action this enabled was a transformation of Rome's military culture. Men seasoned in year-round campaigning became full-time soldiers in all but name. Their skills hardened their identities, shifted from citizen farmers to comrades in arms, whose fortunes rose or fell with the success of their general. When Caesar later crossed the Rubicon, his legions did not disperse to farms and votes, they marched forward. The old social contract, serve when Rome threatened return in peace to reap the harvest, frayed under the weight of constant campaigning, reliable pay, and personal bonds of patronage. The army's center of gravity moved from the civic assembly to the camp command. This was not merely Caesar's personal triumph, it was a political problem with arithmetic. 4 veteran legions then expanded into more could be kept in the field through logistics and the promise of land at discharge. The ratio of time served to civic life inverted. A man might spend 20 years in service and only occasional months in his village. That human calculus altered the incentives of politics. A commander who could offer donativa promotions and veteran settlements could bind soldiers across years in a way a single-year consul could not. The loyalty of men hardened into a resource that commanders could wield at Rome's gates. By winter's light, the consequence was visible in small things: centurions carrying lists, scribes tallying donativa, veterans trading cattle grazing rights for discharge promises. By the time Caesar contemplated the Rubicon, the legal tools were in place, the men were seasoned, and the moral forbiddance against a Roman army crossing into Italy had been worn thin by precedent. One man's decision to keep his legions in the field had remade the social geometry of service, and the immediate question that hovered in every campfire was no longer whether a man would serve Rome, but which Rome a man would serve. A river lay ahead, narrow, deceptively shallow, its banks lined with reeds trembling in an icy wind, and across it was not only the city but the future of the Republic. Who in the end would the soldiers answer to: the ballot, the law, or the man who had kept them fed through winter and rich by summer? Philippi 42 BCE. The plain is wet with the iron tang of blood, and the smoke of campfires. The 2 triumphant armies stand where the Republic's last jury of its fate has just adjourned. Men who once wore the civic toga now wear scarred cuirasses, and the noise is not triumph, but accounting how to pay the legions that have made a man master of Rome. In the weeks after battle, the victors made a single brutal decision. They would turn law into ledger and vengeance into revenue. Proscriptio lists were nailed in public places, names that meant property, inheritance, and a way to feed an army. Appian records this measure not as an afterthought, but as policy. A market opened in blood where land and coin exchanged hands under the seal of legality. The choice was deliberate. The second triumvirate, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, faced 2 immediate problems. They had to settle thousands of fighting men, now used to pay and plunder, and they had to finance fresh campaigns and the machinery of power. Standing levies did not yet exist. What existed was appetite, armies that expected reward. The decision was to make property itself fungible for loyalty. Lists of the proscribed did more than mark enemies for death, they converted assets into pay. Estates were confiscated, art and silver inventoried, and the state sold what it could not hold. The killing served the bookkeeping. Sources estimate the proscription lists named between 300 and 20 men, but the arithmetic touched far more households, clients who lost, patrons, creditors, unpaid tenants evicted. Action moved with administrative efficiency that shocked the old order. Town magistrates and soldiers became revenue agents, auctions followed executions. Italy, which had once supplied the militia, and then the manpower of empire found itself partitioned into stakes for veterans. Appian's account insists on the scale veteran colonies carved across the peninsula, new settlements for men who expected soil to secure their pensions. The grain routes were redirected. Smallholders who survived murder or exile found their fields parceled to strangers in distant cohorts. In market towns, the sound was the clink of coin, and the tearing of household lists. In villas, the smell was of smoke, and the iron tang of stilled gardens. Hunger did not come as a metaphor. Records and later historians suggest real shortages, harvests harried by social rupture, and the sudden displacement of agricultural labor. Why did this arithmetic hold? Because soldiers had learned in years of campaigning the simple logic of loyalty. Promises without payment dissolve into desertion. Octavian observed the lesson in cold numbers. A cohort that could be given land or a lump sum could be bound to a commander a man paid, and sown could be counted on when called. Promises without delivery only created grudges and new conspiracies. The triumvirs treated property as fungible currency. A murdered senator's estate became a veteran's allotment. A confiscated house turned into immediate donativa. The result was a new political economy in which private wealth was legitimated as public payroll. The consequences were immediate and corrosive. The Republic's legal language, the senatorial decree, the lex, the magistrate's oath, was pressed into the service of wartime accounting. The pomerium's old sanctities and the civic ideal of arms as temporary duty unraveled in practice. Men who had served for seasons now expected lifetime connections to commanders who dispensed land and coin. The social fabric of Italy, already frayed by decades of long wars in Spain and the East, tore further as veterans refused to be farm laborers again, and smallholders found themselves tenants of a new colonial class. Famine and fury followed, not only because fields sat empty, but because the settlement of veterans was a political act. It repopulated strategic towns with men whose loyalties were private, not civic. Appian's narrative makes one truth unavoidable at Philippi: the sword became a balance sheet, and the triumvirs learned the cruel arithmetic of loyalty. The civil wars that followed were paid for by confiscations and executions. The peace that closed at Actium was paid for in allotments and bonuses. Octavian discovered that ending internecine slaughter required more than victory in battle. It required an apparatus that could turn military expectation into durable settlement. The apparatus he built would be the Principate's backbone, a state that claims to own the army's time, its vows, and in part its reward. But the apparatus carried its own danger. A republic that survives by assigning land to soldiers is a republic that invites the next general to write his own lists. In Italian towns, men would count their new neighbors. One veteran for every dozen households, one cohort settled on the plain for every grain store, and measure power in terms of boots in the street. The rhetorical question came imperfect and sharp in campfires and councils: who will hold the purse when a new commander decides the ledger? The answer would come slowly, and then in a single fatal sound. The oar beat at Actium, and with it, the image that would haunt Rome for generations: columns of veterans marching home with clay under their nails, and a memory of whose coin had bought them peace. Actium, the Ionian coast, 31 BCE. The air still tasted of salt and burning pitch. The sea glittered with wreckage and the ragged standards of Antony's fleet. Octavian stood where victory had been decided, and unlike the great commanders of the late Republic who ransacked and kept what they could, he faced a different problem: what to do with war's human harvest. The decision was not simply about peace, but about power. A swelling mass of veterans hardened by years of campaigning, whose loyalty had been to their commanders, faces their donativa and the promise of land. Leave them idle, and the city would tremble; disperse them violently, and the Republic's scars would open again. So Octavian chose to transform the instrument of faction into the instrument of order. He ordered demobilization, But demobilization on Rome's terms meant more than sending men home. He cut the ad hoc field from roughly 60 legio to a professional corps of 28, and he fixed those units where the world pressed hardest along the Rhine, the Danube, and the Euphrates. Men who had once been seasonal citizens called up by the Dioctus and bound to duty by property class, and the Sacramentum were now organized into permanent cohorts posted year-round behind earthworks, and palisades their standards planted into a frontier that would not melt with winter. The Praetorian Guard, the cohorts praetoriae, was created as Rome's garrison within the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city, a quiet reversal of an old taboo. Arms now kept watch inside Rome itself for the first time on a permanent basis. The action was surgical. Veterans were settled not by the wholesale confiscation that had fueled earlier civil wars, but by payment and provision. The res gesti Augustus' own record boasts of settling hundreds of thousands with cash and plots, a redistribution meant to bind loyalty through reward rather than plunder. Camps became villages' legionary standards, once the mobile trophies of conquest became the cornerstones of local economies. Legates appointed by the princeps held imperium delegated from Rome and ran provinces more as imperial estates than as instruments of municipal ambition. Where generals had once recruited by appealing to municipal pride, and the civic ideal of home defense recruitment now traveled through imperial channels, promises of regular pay and the career prospects of military life. The consequences altered Roman political arithmetic. An army no longer disbanded with the harvest it trained, garrisoned, and fought year-round. Soldiers' loyalties were increasingly personal, attached to their centurions and to the man who controlled their pay and discharge benefits, rather than diffuse civic obligations to the res publica. The state in Augustus' hands converted wartime levies into a standing force whose time the princeps could buy and allot. By funneling discharge bonuses and later fixed stipends through imperial coffers, that time became a resource. The emperor-administered call to service, leave, and reward all answered to the princeps' ledger. In Rome's forums, the old republican rituals survived in appearance, but the real custodianship of armed men had shifted to an office that combined magistracy with patronage. This settlement bought a brittle peace. Fields reaped by veterans' labor steadied market cities that once feared marauding bands, found garrisons that paid wages and bought goods. Yet the permanence of frontier garrisons created a new social habitus: soldiers made of the army, a profession with its own burial rites, savings, and camaraderie, bound to each other by camp life, rather than to any seasonal return to plough and farmhouse. Archaeology and epitaphs from the Rhine to Britain begin to show that Italy no longer supplied the army as it once did. Provincials enlisted in numbers that made the empire's defense as much a provincial affair as a Roman one. The result was a military community that could bargain as a bloc, more predictable in peace, more dangerous in crisis. A rhetorical question rises from this reshaping: who holds the soldier's time when pay and promise come from one man's hand? Augustus had bought loyalty with land and coin, and in doing so, he solved the immediate arithmetic of civil war. Yet in fixing cohorts to frontiers and swearing soldiers, sacramentum to the princeps, he also placed the great instrument of force into a tighter, more personal topology. On the Rhine, the standards gleamed under a foreign sun, their bronze eagle mouths glinting like accusers. In Italy, the Praetorians watched the Palatine. Order had returned, but it was an order whose foundation was now unmistakable. The princeps owned the army's time. The image lingers, legionary standards set like stakes along the rivers, each one a question: when the ledger falters or a successor miscounts his coin, which way will the standards turn? Rome, AD 6. In the Forum, the stone mouths of temples and the Senate House keep their old, implacable stillness, while on the edges of the city, the campfires of veterans smolder in restless knots. The question that has haunted Rome since the days of the levy is practical and terrible: how to turn men who once went home with season and plough into men who must stand year after year at the empire's thin skin. Augustus answers not with rhetoric alone, but with an accounting ledger and a law. The decision is deliberate. Augustus creates the aerarium militare, a separate chest of money ringed by its own officials and fed by new levies on inheritances and auctions, expressly to pay premia and to guarantee a soldier's end-of-service reward. The aim is twofold: to detach veterans' hopes from the caprice of generals, and to bind loyalty to the office that dispenses the money, the princeps. Tacitus and Suetonius make the shift plain: the sacramentum is no longer merely to the res publica, the republic; it is sworn in the name of the princeps. This is legal architecture as social psychology. Money and an oath together remodel loyalty. The action is concrete and disciplinary. Service terms are standardized. A legionary's thread of life now stretches to about 20 years, auxiliaries to roughly 25, with the promise that the latter will receive Roman citizenship at discharge, a passport to status and legal rights. Augustus clamps down on private patronage. Commanders may no longer trade land and largesse as they once did to secure men's loyalty. Marriage is restricted. Soldiers are formally barred from connubia while under arms, not because Rome hates family, but because garrisons must not be split by households and loyalties must be concentrated on unit and emperor. Promotions are systematized. Centurions and officers become a predictable career ladder rather than prizes in the temporary spoils of a campaign. Why these choices? The law is a response to the monster of experience. Years of warfare across seas and frontiers had hollowed the old census-based levy. A man who returned from Spain to find his farm ruined had no reason to answer the call again. Generals who settled veterans from their own plunder, created private following soldiers, learned the arithmetic of dependence. Augustus chooses to buy, instead of bully regular pay, a guaranteed premium and land, often settled by the state on veteran colonies, convert personal greed into institutional steadiness. The Res Gesti Augustus, proclamation of achievements, boasts of these settlements. Contemporary historians show both the stabilizing effect and the political logic behind them. The consequence is immediate and profound. The Roman army ceases to be an intermittently mustered citizen militia and becomes a professional salaried community. Camps harden into homes, forts hold drills through winter, and garrison standards mark a permanence of purpose. Auxiliary units, once mere provincial contingents, now become instruments of Romanization, serve 25 years, receive citizenship, and the provinces supply the manpower that Italy no longer can. The ranks swell not with seasonal farmers, but with men who plan for a pension and a plot of land at the end of long service. A centurion's authority is backed by paybooks, not the casual will of an annual magistrate. There is, however, in Augustus' reform a fragile logic. What buys loyalty can be withheld. The aerarium militare centralizes responsibility. The state is the paymaster and the patron. But a single point of failure now exists. A missed payment, a delayed premium, or a disputed settlement does not merely provoke complaint, it creates a political lever. Soldiers who swear the sacramentum to a man, not an abstraction, expect that man to protect their pensions and their land. When the treasury coughs, or when succession hangs uncertain like weather over the frontier, the bonds of service are tested. What buys loyalty? Money, land, or law? And which of these will hold when the hand that signs the orders is cold? The late Augustan years answer with a new practical truth. Boundaries and barracks make soldiers professional, but their loyalties have been privatized toward an office, and offices pass like crowns. In the winter night at a Rhine fort, the metallic clink of coin into a centurion's palm is a small decisive sound. 3,000 amphorae of grain cannot substitute for a promised donative. Tacitus records the smoke and tense negotiations when these calculations go wrong. In AD 14, when Augustus dies, the arrangement he painstakingly built will be exposed to the simplest test. Will the new princeps open the purse in time? The emperor has bought stability with a bureaucracy of pay and law, yet his heir inherits not only a throne but a troop ledger. At the moment when the august hand that signed the premia stills, the question hangs over the empire like a standard in a wind. Who in the coming dark will keep faith with 300,000 men, whose lives are counted in years and denarii? A tombstone half buried in the red earth of Hispania speaks, first a name, a unit, a soldier who died far from the farm where he was born. The letters are tidy. Someone has carved dis manibus above a service record. Around the same years in Gallia and along the Danubius, other stones tell the same story. Centurions, age's origins, and often the phrase that mattered most to a man on the edge of empire miles, cohortalis, a soldier of the cohort. The scene is small and private, dust-chiseled stone, the tang of iron from armor left in a hut. But it is decisive. Confronted with a world that would not stop in winter Rome, and its men chose a different bargain. The decision was not sudden but pragmatic. Campaigns that once fit a season now crossed seas and mountains, Sicily, Spain, and the East required garrisons that could not simply melt away with the harvest. Augustus, after Actium, made a practical choice. The legions would no longer be an annual levy summoned from the Campus Martius. Instead, cohorts would be fixed to frontiers, forts garrisoned year-round, and veterans settled with rewards that came from a new dedicated military purse. The aerarium militare was created to pay premia, and the sacramentum, a man swore, began to bind him more directly to a person, the princeps, than to an abstract res publica. So the action followed. Once permanent camps rose like small towns along the Rhine, the Danube, and in Spain. A legion, some 50 men give or take, was no longer a temporary assembly but a permanent community with its own routines. Drills replaced seasonal spike work. Sentries paced the ramparts at night, while cooks tended kettles that smelled of lard and barley. Men rotated patrols, learned local dialects, married across serving communities where permitted, and kept savings by sending money home or burying it in belt pouches. Auxilia, the non-citizen troops, were promised citizenship on discharge. That promise was a contract worth everything to a provincial youth. The result was a steady flow of provincials into the ranks. Italy itself supplied fewer recruits, while the provinces supplied more men drawn by pay, legal status, and the chance for land. The consequence was cultural as well as military. The army ceased to be merely an instrument of civic defense and became a distinct social body. As Mary Beard and Adrian Goldsworthy have pointed out, this was a shift of identity. Soldiers lived, worshipped, and litigated within a shared military world. They swore the sacramentum to a commander, ate in common, and maintained savings clubs or burial associations to care for the dead. Within the fort, there were funerary cults, shrines to native gods alongside the standards vexilla, and a tacit law of the camp enforced by centurions and tribunals. The military community had its own discipline and its own economy. Men wrote wills in the presence of comrades, and veterans expected the settlement promised by emperors or generals. Here, a rhetorical question pierces what makes a soldier a professional. It is not only length of service, though terms stretch to 20 years or more, but the deepening of mutual expectations between commander and man. Donatives, land grants, and regular stipends turned service into a career. A soldier's fortunes could rise with a general's victories. His social path could be transformed by the auxiliaries' reward of citizenship. Training and common life hardened loyalty away from the patchwork civic allegiances of the Italian countryside, and toward the unit, the standard, the man who supplied pay and patronage. This professionalization had practical strengths. Cohort-based legions were more maneuverable and better drilled for prolonged garrison duty. They built roads, guarded supply lines, and policed an empire that stretched beyond the old seasonal horizon. Archaeological traces, granaries, barracks tiles stamped with unit marks, and epitaphs listing origins from distant provinces tell of men who served a lifetime and of units that outlived single elections. Inscriptions show names from Hispania Gallia and the Danubius carved with pride a centurion steel, might list service under 3 different commanders spolium shared, and disputes settled by the unit's own officers. But every strength carries a danger. A professional army is a bargaining community. When pay faltered, when promised land failed to appear, or when a new commander seemed less generous, cohorts could threaten more than desertion. They could take their grievances to the very heart of power. A legion in winter quarters is a concentrated vote in armored form, numerically obvious. 1 legion of some 50 men is a tangible instrument of coercion, and psychologically tight-knit. The soldier who dug a grave with comrades would protect his share of expected rewards fiercely. The action this arrangement invited was not theoretical. By the death of Augustus, 300,000 trained professionals stood along Rome's borders, and in its garrison towns, each man bound by oath and expectation. The consequence waited like a storm. When the princeps died, those men would not simply vanish back to plough and vine. They would bargain mutiny, swear for donatives, and ultimately choose emperors as much as emperors prized them. The image that lingers is of the Danubian legionary, by his campfire the smell of smoke, and mutton in the air, his hand on a man-sized shield, as he listens for the word that will decide whether he will be a veteran with land, or a soldier owed money, and left to reckon with his own arms, who then keeps the purse when the oath binds to a person and not to the city. News of Augustus. Death crossed the frontiers like a wind through a bivouac. A courier's hoof, a shouted name, the sudden odor of smoke, where men burned paper of the old reign. On the Rhine and in the Danube basin, the army sat packed into timber forts and winter quarters, the standards dark against a low sky, and a question hung in the air that had never before risen so insistently. Who now keeps the oath? Tacitus will later paint the scene as half negotiation, half threat, campfires ringed by drawn sword centurions, faces lit by flame, soldiers naming grievances as plainly as they sharpened their pila. 1,000 men or 10,000, a single cohort, a full legion of roughly 5,000, could decide whether a commander spoke for Rome or for himself. Who then did they serve? The decision that men in arms made was the simplest a soldier can make: press for a bargain or go quiet and rot. Across Pannonia and Germania, the same needs boiled into complaints: arrears in pay, extended enlistments, the bitterness of centurions who lorded over men long away from land and family. The mutineers wanted shorter service and protection from officers they called cruel. They wanted donativa, an immediate acknowledgement that the death of an Augustus changed the economy of loyalty. In some camps, an exactor with a loud tongue could stir a crowd by night. In others, veterans traded memories of plunder and promise. Germanicus, dispatched into the turmoil, moved like a negotiator and a soldier at once, sitting among the fires, meeting mutineers face to face, listening for the point at which authority could be rebuilt without bloodletting. Tacitus presents him as bargaining under a steel sky, the army's caprice made argument and reward indistinguishable. Tiberius chose the politics of purchase and reform. He bought time with generous donativa money that could be transferred at once and spent at once. He reshuffled commands, promoted men whose loyalty he wished to keep, and sent trusted lieutenants to quiet the worst outbreaks. The princeps' decisive act was not merely cash, but system. A military treasury and fixed pensions already existed in principle. Now they had to function as instruments of rule. The immediate action was pragmatic, a discharge bonus here, a centurion cashiered there. But the consequence was structural. Soldiers who had been promised land or pay now understood that their fortunes depended less on the old Roman assemblies and more on the man who could deliver both coin and a certificate of rank. The oath that had once been a civic bond had been subtly reoriented. Men now swore and served toward a patron who could reward their years. Consequence spread outward like ripples from a thrown stone. What began as a short local rebellion became a demonstration of a new military psychology. 300,000 professionals now stood as Rome's shield and spear men who trained between seasons rather than returning to farms veterans who expected an imperial promise to be fulfilled. Their world was one of forts and donatives of long service terms that stretched 20 years or more of careers that ran through century on it, and standard rather than through town council and field. The army had grown a corporate life of its own, shared camping songs, burial rites, savings petitions. And with that life came collective bargaining. Where once a farmer citizen might be recalled in spring to take up arms, now whole communities of soldiers could coordinate grievances that threatened policy succession, even the capital itself. And yet the most dangerous consequence was not financial, but legal and psychological. The sacramentum, the soldier's oath, had begun to bind to a man, rather than to the res publica, the public thing. That subtle shift meant frontiers could make emperors. Soldiers who received land money and status from a general learned the arithmetic of loyalty: give me what was promised, or your rival will. Sulla had already marched on Rome. Caesar had taught men to die for a single name. Now, with Augustus dead and Tiberius buying fleeting peace, the empire contained within its ranks the capacity to choose rulers by standard and not by ballot. Listen to the image. Tacitus leaves a campfire, the embers like the eyes of 1,000 men, the centurions, belts clinking, the standards shifting with each whispered promise. The mutinies of AD 14 were quelled, but the lesson was set in iron. Guards could be paid, placated, or provoked in the future. They would not simply defend Rome's borders, they would determine its fate. Which standard would flicker next, and whose hand would lift it toward the city? Who owns a soldier's loyalty? In the winter of 91-88 BCE, the question rang through a peninsula lit by smoke and the iron tang of fresh blood. In towns from Apulia to Etruria, men who had carried Rome's standards, the socii, stood not as foreigners on a parade ground, but as veterans at ruined thresholds, their wives and children among the cinders. They had sworn the sacramentum and bled in Rome's wars, yet, when they returned, their names did not open the doors to magistracies, the courts, or the vote. The decision that followed was not a quiet legal reform, but a political furnace. Either Rome would extend the franchise, reshaping the republic's civic map, or it would fight the men who refused to be second-class soldiers beneath the same banners. The action was immediate and brutal. Cities rose in federation. Entire communities seceded from Rome's levy, the Dauctus, that had once been a neat municipal tally. Bands of veterans, now rebels in arms, took the field under their own standards and commanders. The social war did not move in neat columns, but in 1,000 local combustion sieges, in the Abruzzi pitched battles where the roads met, and dust hid the blood, the war cry of men who demanded the rights they had defended. Roughly 100,000 Italians poured into that struggle, a human tide whose numbers Rome could not easily ignore. The Senate's answer was law. The Lex Iulia and the Lex Placia Papiria were passed, folding Italian communities into the rights of Roman citizenship. The legal map, who could be levied, who could vote, who could be a juror, changed overnight, but the change came as the product of a knife at Rome's throat rather than a magistrate's patient reform. That legal inclusion carried an immediate, unforeseen military consequence. Where once commanders raised men by town and tribe, by municipal registers and property classes, they now confronted an ocean of new citizens who had learned to follow the man at their head. To refill shattered cohorts, officers stitched together forces with voluntary recruits drawn not by the census but by personal ties, neighbors, clients, proteges, who had fought together in the winter and would not disperse with the spring. The traditional civic frame, seasonal service, quick campaigns, the return to fields, was fraying. Men had seen long wars, winter quarters, regular pay, and the habit of shared danger. Generals discovered that loyalty could be purchased or earned by promises of land, by donativa, or by the simple magnetism of victorious command. A legionnaire whose life and expectation had been shaped under one general's, I did not easily resume the rhythms of the old citizen militia. The consequence was political as much as military. With Italy now a single body of citizens, numerically swelled and geographically dispersed, Roman commanders acquired a larger pool of men whose careers were made in the field, and whose rewards lay with the man who could deliver them. The ballot box in Rome had grown, but the ballot box did not feed a hungry veteran. Land pensions and positions did. The loyalties formed in camp, shared fear, shared bounty, the daily work of lifting shields shoulder to shoulder, translated into raw political capital, where once a consul's authority had been checked by a year's office, and the myth of service to the res publica commanders began to calculate loyalty in recruits and retinues. Networks replaced municipalities. A centurion from Picenum could bring 3 or 4 cohorts to a patron. A well-known general could field thousands who would follow him across Italy. And so the social war's remedy carried within it a new disease. Citizenship made the Italian man equal before the law, but it also made him a professional possibility, a man to be recruited, rewarded, and retained by a commander with resources and charisma. The Republic's levy had been reconfigured without a change in Rome's appetite for land and spoils. The army's composition had shifted from the seasonal property-based militia of Polybius' sketches to a force whose center of gravity was the camp and the general. The forward pull was immediate, and dangerous columns of veterans, hardened by long service and bound by personal ties, stood closer to the road to Rome than ever before. Vexilla snapped tubi blared from the castra, pitch sweat and river mud clung to their caligae. Standards stood perilously close to the Appian Way.